Dzień dobry. After yesterday's night concert, I have a pleasure to talk to Marko Ciciliani, a composer with very unconventional ideas, both unconventional and very musical. So we had a fine example yesterday of it. I agreed with the composer that he will start with a lecture about this project and some larger context of what we heard yesterday. So now, please, Marko Ciciliani.
Thank you. I would just like to say a few introductory words. The piece that was performed last night is an older piece of mine. I composed it 14 years ago, but at the opening of the festival, I also presented an installation. I don't know if any of you saw it. It was in the Philharmonie, which is a more recent work. The title of this installation is Why Frets? Tombstone. And Why Frets is a series of works that are all relating to the electric guitar. It's actually a coincidence that I had this guitar installation and last night again a performance with electric guitars, but I thought I'll continue the theme of the electric guitar. And what I would like to present to you now is another part of the Why Frets project. It's a performance lecture with the title Requiem for the Electric Guitar. Before I start, maybe just a very few general words about me. So I've been trained originally as an instrumental composer, but I've been working with electronic media for a long time, and basically since the beginning. But in a way, the role has become more and more important for me. So in a way, the whole sort of question how we can use media in a live situation is something I find very interesting. And since about 20 years, I've been also working audiovisually. In the beginning, I was working especially with lights and performance, so I could develop special, you could say, choreographed light designs as part of compositions. Then I explored video and music, live-generated video most of the time, where I was very explicitly interested in the musical relationship between image and sound. And more recently, I would say that sort of my multimedia way of working has become more fluent. So nowadays, I also ended up working, as you will see, with texts, writing texts, designing websites that are part of works, etc. So in a way, this sort of interdisciplinary way of working and thinking is something that I find very exciting. And this morning I was briefly at Simon's presentation and of his performers, and there also this question was briefly addressed, is it music or what is music? This is a question which I have not completely abandoned, but in my multimedia work, it's something that I don't consider anymore. So of course, in many things I do, of course, I think about very specific musical questions, but in the designing of specific projects, the question, is it music or not, has become rather irrelevant, and I find that very liberating. Okay, but now I would like to jump into this second part, or it's not necessarily the second part, but it's the other part that also relates to the presentation of the guitar installation. And yeah, the title is Why Frets? Requiem for the Electric Guitar. 150 years ago, US-American inventor George Beauchamp assembled an odd-looking object, a string instrument that he nicknamed the frying pan. The Rickenbacker A22, as it was officially named, was released in 1933 and made history as the very first electric guitar ever produced. an instrument that shaped popular music until its demise a few decades ago. The crucial technology that Beecham's design made revolutionary was the pickup. The basic working principle of the electric guitar is this electromagnetic sensor, which uses induction to react to the movement of a vibrating metallic object that enters its magnetic field by generating an electric current. Here you can see a modern version of a pickup. The electric current it generates can then be turned into sound by means of amplification. And this is why electric guitars only use steel strings, since gut strings or nylon strings would not produce any induction and therefore no sound at all. But was this groundbreaking innovation truly Beecham's own creation? My recent research has uncovered striking new evidence that shows, without a doubt, that the electromagnetic pickup was in fact created a full century earlier by a British engineer of German origin named Sieglinde Stern. The documents I have found strongly suggest that Beecham indeed knew of this technology, which he appropriated and economically exploited. In this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, I will present to you the story of Sieglinde Stern and discuss the reasons that prevented her, until now, from getting the recognition she deserves as one of the great innovators in the history of music technology. My earlier research centered on the early activities of the Royal Institution of Great Britain, founded in 1799, and specifically how this institution reached out to the general population with a series of public lectures on science. In the course of this project, I repeatedly came across the name of a woman named Sieglinde Stern, who stood out as a rare female in an overwhelmingly male audience. As it turned out, Stern was part of an important industrialist family whose archives are still extant today and include, among many others, several volumes of her diaries and over 200 of her letters. The Sterns were a Jewish family of German origin. A few years before Sieglinde's birth, they migrated from Frankfurt to London, where her father became an important industrialist. His business ventures involved the textile industry, one of the main driving forces behind Britain's Industrial Revolution. Meanwhile, Sieglinde's mother came from a family of weavers and was a true master in this craft. Drawing from this expertise, she taught Sieglinde from an early age how to operate a hand loom with using both standard and advanced techniques. As any daughter of a well-to-do family at the time, Sieglinde was also educated in music, becoming a proficient amateur violinist. However, her diaries leave no doubt that her true interest and that subjects that truly captured her attention were modern science and new technologies. This interest in science and technology was spurred by the many visits she made to her father's factory. Although her father took her and her siblings there primarily for her brother, as he expected him to eventually take over the business, it was Sieglinde who was deeply impressed by the power and capability of the machineries. A note from her diary from when she was only 14 years old offers a good example of the impression this made on her.
To think these machines perform the same labor as the weaving techniques Mother has shown me. The speed, the precision. Truly, if these power looms can work so fast and so well, can they not bring good fortune to a society as a whole in countless other ways?
It is important to note that the textile industry was one of the most developed sectors of Britain's early industrialization, and therefore it generated new inventions. However, it also created horrific conditions for its workers with long working days, low salaries, and frequent accidents. There is no doubt that Sieglinde was especially fascinated by the way weaving could integrate the ancient tradition that she had learned and mastered from her mother, combined with entirely new cutting-edge technologies that, under the leadership of men like her own father, were rapidly transforming the society in which she lived. Such combination of tradition and innovation, as well as her familiarity and expertise in these two modes of thinking, was crucial in the series of events that led her to invent the electromagnetic pickup. Sieglinde's interest in science led her to attend, as a teenager, the lectures offered at the relatively newly founded Royal Institution of Great Britain. There she was able to hear, among others, Michael Faraday, who was to become one of the organization's most prominent members. It is also while attending these lectures that she met and became romantically involved with Charles Anderson, who, after a short military career, was soon to become Michael Faraday's assistant. In 1831, in the meantime, Sieglinde Stern has taken a managing position at her father's factory. Faraday spent a little over 3 months in an intense series of experiments at the Royal Institution that eventually led to his discoveries in the field of induction. Charles Anderson assisted him throughout this period. As the experiments grew in complexity, it became clear that Faraday needed an additional assistant, a position for which Anderson suggested Sieglinde Stern. At first skeptical at the idea of letting a woman into his lab, he eventually trusted Anderson's reassurances and praise for the understanding of physics that Stern had developed both through individual study and by attending the lectures at the Royal Institution. Faraday was not disappointed. Stern very quickly picked up on his experiments, as we can see in this excerpt from her diary dated November 2nd, 1831.
Faraday is quite right. Magnetism and electricity are connected, just like Ørsted and Arago have argued. Further, we have shown very well that electricity can create magnetic forces. But how shall we prove that the reverse relationship also obtains? Faraday seems certain he can convert magnetism into electricity. Think of the marvels that should arise if motion and magnetism can generate electricity.
Sieglinde also described in greater detail the individual steps through which Faraday eventually reached his goals. Here is another note describing an experiment from a few weeks later, November 29.
First, we wound 26 feet of copper wire round a wooden cylinder as a helix. Next, a second copper wire was wound on top of this. This process was repeated till we had 12 coils of wire, all insulated from each other. We then connected the free ends of all the even coils to compose one continuous length, and likewise with the odd coils. Now, with 2 helices, Faraday connected one end to a galvanometer and the other to a voltaic pile. And yet, this didn't work. It took 2 more days of experimentation with longer wires of diverse materials. But then the miracle finally happened, just like Faraday had expected. When switching on the pile, the galvanic needle danced to one side. When disconnected it gently returned to its place. Spectacular!
The professional relationship with Faraday ended after this phase of experimentation on induction, and the sources I consulted do not mention him again. Yet, less than 2 years later, she put the principle of induction to use in a different way when she invented the first electromagnetic pickup, which she used also in the first electric string instrument. The innovative character of Stern's design came from the fact that she abandoned the shape of the magnetic ring, opting instead for a magnetic rod, which created magnetic fields in its vertical extension. And this made it particularly suitable for picking up subtle motions of small metallic objects, as such of a metal string. It seems obvious that her familiarity with weaving is what allowed Stern to develop this device. More specifically, the so-called flying shuttle appears to have served as a design template for her pickup. Invented by John Kay in 1733, the flying shuttle was a crucial technology that allowed for the acceleration of the weaving process and its industrialization. The flying shuttle dispenses the warp while being thrown across the loom. What makes this possible is that the flying shuttle contains a spool called the bobbin, which includes the so-called pern, from which the yarn unwinds as it travels from one side of the loom to the other. Stern's design of the pickup was modeled on the rod, the key difference residing in the materials used. In the flying shuttle used in weaving, the pern is usually made of wood or metal, and the thread is of cotton or wool. Her innovation was to replace the rod with a magnetic metal and the yarn with shielded copper wire, resulting in an electromagnetic pickup. Although relatively simple, this design would have been difficult to imagine without Sieglinde's expertise in both weaving and physics. Although in retrospect, the invention of the magnetic pickup appears to us as a massively important development in music technology, it did not result in fame and fortune for Sieglinde Stern. Rather than obtaining a patent and exploiting it economically, she put her invention to use in a much more private and secretive manner. Early 19th century England was teeming with secret societies. Sieglinde's father, for example, was a member of one of the most prominent ones, the Freemasons. In my book, Sharing is Daring, The Propagation of Information and Knowledge in 19th Century Great Britain, I have examined the multiple ways in which secret societies participated in the spread of scientific knowledge among the English population. Sieglinde Stern was herself a member of another such group called the Sisters of the Harmonic Constellation. As its name suggests, this was an exclusively female organization, and it brought together women that had a thirst for knowledge and debate on subjects ranging from philosophy to physics. The group had been created a few decades earlier by Mary Taylor, who I will return to later. Taylor herself was married to prominent Thomas Taylor, whose famous translations of Plotinus and teachings in Neoplatonism became central to the discussions of the Sisters of the Harmonic Constellation. This interest in Neoplatonism brought the sisters to collectively study Pythagoras' system of harmony, from which the group took its name. For Pythagoras, the concept of harmony characterizes all aspects of our existence, from the way the human soul is constructed to the planetary system. However, the sisters of the harmonic constellation interestingly disagreed with some aspects of Pythagorean theory, arguing that validating a harmonic system strictly on the basis of simple numeric ratios and the prioritization of consonants seemed inappropriate for the cultural situation they lived in. After a lengthy debate, they agreed that the perfect harmony had to be characterized by a balance between two opposing powers, consonance and dissonance. In accordance to the music of their time, they only saw musical and cultural progress when consonances and dissonances met and interacted in a dynamic fashion. While members of the Sisters of the Harmonic Constellation were typically well-read women, Sieglinde Stern stood out by her unusually advanced knowledge both of traditional weaving techniques and of the most recent developments in the textile industry. An active participant in the group's discussions, she often used weaving, that is, the integration of two perpendicular systems, the warp and the weft, as metaphors in her interpretations of Plotinus and Pythagoras. In weaving, she would often point out, the weft and the warp can be made of different materials, but if one is absent, the fabric falls apart. The sisters thus sought the musical interval that could best express a balance, such as the one present in every woven piece of cloth, which leads to its unique quality, firm but also soft. In other words, in response to Pythagoras, the sisters searched for a single harmony that unites opposites, that is, at the same time, harmony and dissonance. But which interval has this quality of being a harmony, a consonance, and a dissonance? The answer was 7/4. Why 7/4? The 7/4 interval is a minor seventh, but due to the particular tuning of the harmonic series, it is 31 cents flat. In Western music, we are trained to identify a seventh as a dissonance. And dissonances are characterized by a friction and restlessness that ask for resolution. However, the minor seventh has much less friction when it is tuned according to the 7/4 ratio than in any other standard tuning system. Less friction means, from a purely sonic point of view, that it resembles a consonance. But at the same time, it is still identified as the interval treated in music as a dissonance. The way it incorporates opposing forces is what made this interval the unification of consonance and dissonance in the minds of the sisters of the harmonic constellation. Let us listen to the difference between the equal temperament seventh. Now we're going to hear an example which will rest on the justly intoned 7/4 seventh. It was in order to reproduce this particular interval and to use it with the sisters of the harmonic constellation that Sieglinde Stern built the first electroacoustic string instrument, the dichord. Here you can see an authentic reproduction of her instrument based on detailed documents that she left behind. And just as later became common in electric guitars, Sieglinde used a solid body for the instrument rather than the hollow resonating body around which all other stringed acoustic instruments had been built up to that time. Because of that, the instrument had a very long sustained time. With acoustic instruments, a lot of the energy contained in the vibration of the string is used up to put the resonating body into vibration. And as a consequence, the sustained of a plucked string has a rather limited duration. Sieglinde's solid body instrument, by contrast, didn't have to excite a complex resonating body, and so the energy of the vibrating string dissipated much more slowly, allowing the string to continue vibrating for much longer. The long sustain of the dichord struck the sisters as having an almost magical quality. On the other hand, the absence of a resonating body also meant that the dichord produced a very soft sound. Today, the same pickup technology is used to shake the walls of buildings, but back then, amplifiers and efficient loudspeaker systems had not yet been developed. Hence, it was only possible to amplify the sound minimally, making it unsuitable for public performances with a large audience. Sieglinde's instrument had only 2 strings, no fingerboard and no frets. Her sole invention in creating it was to produce the 7/4 interval with its eerie, otherworldly sound. Sieglinde put her unique instrument to use exclusively with the sisters of the harmonic constellation. It became part of a ritual they developed, a sort of meditation where the women sat together, regularly exciting the strings of the instrument and diving with all their attention into the sonic properties. The instrument was simply called the dichord in reference to Pythagoras' monochord. The design shows a number of interesting details. The length and maximum width follow a precise 7:4 ratio. You can see 2 stars that are embossed in the wood, each with a pickup at its center. The stars are a reference to Sieglinde's last name, as Stern in German means star in English, but also to the term constellation, which is part of the name of a group. When you look more closely, you will see that one of the stars has 4 spikes and the other one 7 spikes, a clear reference to the harmony for which the instrument was designed. In addition, you see a wooden overlay that forms an infinity sign. This was again a reference to Pythagoras' belief in an eternal celestial harmony. On the back of the instrument, the 4 and 7 spiked stars are fused in a single embossed shape, which points at the unification and consolidation of opposites. Sieglinde Stern passed away in 1859. It would be another 9 years before women were even admitted at universities in Great Britain. The sisters of the harmonic constellation continued to meet and use the dichord until eventually it fell into oblivion. But that was not the end of the pickup. When Sieglinde was in her 50s, she and her partner briefly hosted her distant cousin Johannes Maria August Stroh, who had just immigrated from Frankfurt to London. After arriving in London, he took the name John Stroh, sometimes also August Stroh. Trained as a clock and watchmaker, Stroh eventually established his own business, developing a variety of inventions. His most notable ones were additions to the ABC telegraph and the Wheatstone automatic that were the main technologies for telecommunication by the British Post Office. Sieglinde felt a kinship, as they were both, because of their shared interest in technology. And therefore, she must have shared her design for the pickup, but it was only 20 years later after her death that he first mentioned it in an 1882 paper entitled On Attraction and Repulsion Due to Sonorous Vibrations and a Comparison of the Phenomena with Those of Magnetism. It was published by the Journal of the Society of Telegraph Engineers and Electricians. The early 1900s saw the development of the recording industry, which could only employ relatively loud instruments, as microphones were not yet developed. Stroh seized on the opportunity, developing the Stroh violin that made him world famous. However, these and all others of his designs were purely mechanical and therefore make no use of Sieglinde's invention. Some years later, Stroh's violins attracted the attention of one George Beauchamp, who was on a similar quest to make musical instruments louder. And indeed, Beauchamp visited Stroh in London in 1914. It is not clear whether he has taken advantage of the declining faculties of the elder Strohs, who was now already in his 80s, or whether Stroh was fully aware when he passed on Stern's design drawings of the pickup. Although the sketches themselves are now lost, Stroh does regretfully mention in one of his last diary entries that his cousin's drawings are in Beauchamp's possession now. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, in 1933, Beauchamp incorporated the principle of the pickup in his designs of the first electric guitar. However, in none of his writings or patents did he mention that the principle originated in Sieglinde Stern's designs. And so, a woman's crucial contribution to the history of musical technology was erased from public memory. Sieglinde's name had another missed connection with fame when David Bowie took on the alter ego Ziggy Stardust in 1972. It is well known that the character was inspired by Vince Taylor, a rock musician whom excessive drug use had endowed with the belief that he was an alien god on Earth. What is much less known is that Taylor was a descendant of Mary Taylor, who I mentioned earlier, the founder of the Sisters of the Harmonic Constellation. In his delirium, Taylor would sometimes refer to the organization of which his own grandmother had been a member. Gathering inspiration whenever he could, Bowie questioned Taylor on the characters that had been part of this constellation, only to hear of a spirit who basically reinvented music by the name of Sieglinde Stern. David Bowie took a liking to the sound of the name and modified it to Ziggy Stardust. And supposedly, Sieglinde had red hair. Over time, the electric guitar became a symbol of rock and roll and the rebelling youth. Unlike the acoustic guitar, which was played by men and women alike, the electric guitar was almost exclusively played by male musicians. Led by such towering figures such as Chuck Berry or Jimi Hendrix, it was turned into a sexualized symbol of male potency. The instrument became the most iconic phallic symbol and an embodiment of electric sound, a symbolism that probably reached its apex when Prince made it ejaculate. The symbolism took a life on its own in the practice of air guitar. Air guitar isolated and exaggerated the chauvinistic gesture while paradoxically performing self-castration by relinquishing the materiality of the instrument itself. The media scholar Steve Waxman argues that the performance practice of electric guitar led to the extinction of the instrument by giving an increasingly prominent place to the male postures and gestures, eventually overcoming the corporeality of the instrument in a process he called transcendental technofallacy. For Waxman, I quote, "Despite the disappearance of the guitar as a physical object, in the practice of air guitar it became eternal in the minds of its followers, imbued with a godlike status while the player acted as a priest." End of quote. However, in my opinion, a better interpretation of this decline of the electric guitar was offered by Varga Takac when in 2059 he introduced the so-called species turn in the genealogy of musical instruments. This theoretical approach, which I will be following in my last comments, suggests the exact opposite. For Takac, rather than dissolving the guitar's corporeality through air guitar, what eventually led to the guitar's demise was the maximalization of the guitar's materiality. As I begin to wrap up this presentation, let's notice the importance of the number 33 throughout this history. In 1733, John Kay invented the flying shuttle, which served as a model when Stern invented the first electromagnetic pickup in 1833. George Beauchamp then used it in the first electric guitar in 1933. Today, we are in the year 2083, another 150 years later. Where do things stand now with the electric guitar? As is well known, the year 2033, once more the number 33, saw the final public performance with an electric guitar, namely of, at that time, 75-year-old Thurston Moore, whose earlier work with Sonic Youth had already redefined rock music through a variety of experimental practices that influenced the New York downtown scene of the 1980s. Since then, the electric guitar has been all but abandoned from public performances. This demise can be explained by using Varga Takac's theoretical species framework. Contrary to Waxman's transcendental technofallacy, this approach centers not so much on air guitar and the dissolution of its corporeality, but rather on a maximization of the electric guitar's materiality. As is well known, the heavy metal genre celebrated the guitar as a tool to display chauvinism. In order to match the idiomatic tonal register of the metal growl, in order to match this particular tonal register, metal musicians soon decided that 6 strings on the electric guitar did not suffice. The instrument had to go lower. So, at first, a 7th string was added, then an 8th, a 9th, a 10th, an 11th, and you can guess where this is going. Strings were added until the instrument became unplayable. According to Varga Takac's species framework, the electric guitar suffered a similar destiny as that of the Irish deer. The Irish deer became extinct around 7,700 years ago. This was the result of a gradual growth of the animal antlers through sexual selection. Every generation of male Irish deer kept growing larger and larger antlers, a powerful symbol of strength and potency that eventually proved to be a crucial handicap. It was a handicap when it came to being chased through the woods, for example, by hunters, but in addition, it also created a nutritional burden. And over time, this led to the extinction of this species. So, according to Takacs, a similar so-called maladaptation led to the end of the electric guitar. However, here we find something truly remarkable. The growing number of parallel strings in the latest models of the electric guitars show a striking resemblance with the parallel wefts of a hand loom. And so, if you will allow me to drift away from the strictest methodological standards to close this talk, I would dare to speculate that at the very end of the electric guitar's lifespan, it finally revealed its repressed origins. Like a guilty conscience suppressed for more than 200 years, the mark of Sieglinde Stern finally became visible, symbolized by the craft that inspired her in the first place, the art of weaving. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks for the lecture. What I was trying to guess while listening to your lecture was how it relates to what we heard yesterday at the concert. I find the sounds you produced in your composition were simply beautiful, and I can't find any relation with this character of electric guitar as a symbol of male domination, of sexual potency, and so on. So, and the more general question is, why did you? Yes, the general question about how does your lecture relate to your composition?
This lecture doesn't relate to last night's composition directly. I think I have a sort of, I have to say I really like the electric guitar with the sounds it produces, but I also find it very fascinating because of this sort of sociological complexity as with its symbolism and this sort of gender disbalance in its musical practice and so on. And I mean, the sonic properties I explored in the piece that we heard last night is definitely not like the standard repertoire of the electric guitar. So, but I mean, as a project, this is more relating to the installation which I had at the opening of the festival. And for me, I mean, it's obvious that this is fortunately or unfortunately a made-up history. It's I used many existing persons to build it, but Sieglinde Stern did not really exist. But I wanted to propose this as a sort of thought experiment, to imagine a sort of alternative view on the history of things and how we might read things differently if we would know that history had happened differently. And so in this sense, this is in a way the core element how I developed this whole series of pieces in the Y Frets project. So the third piece is an audiovisual performance where I videotaped a short piece of about 5 minutes for 3 electric guitars. But then the actual performance is me processing the recording of these guitars with electronics. So basically, again, the guitars are present and absent at the same time because they are not played live. Well, last night it was played live. When I composed this piece 14 years ago, I was mainly, I was interested in exploring the sonic possibilities of the guitar apart from the standard playing techniques. And by laying the guitar flat on the table, it immediately makes certain things impossible and many other things possible. Obviously, I was by far not the first one to put the guitar flat on the table, so this is also a very rich performance practice, but of course one which is more hidden than the standard way of playing it.
Certainly, electric guitar is a sociological subject. It's a very wide subject that worth considering and worth further investigations. Well, so perhaps I will ask the public, do you have any questions to the composer?
In your presentation, we have seen a symbol of yin and yang. A symbol of yin and yang.
Yes.
So could you tell us some more about possible Far Eastern roots of the invention of Siegerlinde?
Well, here the reference was the theory by Thomas Taylor. Thomas Taylor is one of those figures that truly existed. And he he wrote books about Neoplatonism. And in Neoplatonism, there are many half esoteric and also Eastern ideas incorporated. And so this was in a way the debate that was important for the sisters of the harmonic constellation, but then the sisters are again a made-up thing. But what is true is that Thomas Taylor was highly influential at this time, and he was very popular. In retrospect, he's a kind of what's the correct way to say this? Like from today's perspective, he's not taken very seriously as a researcher, but and also in the way how he represented Neoplatonism, but he definitely had a strong influence and also facilitated the sort of reception of Eastern ideas. And this is why I built in the yin and yang symbol. And also because this whole interest of the sisters culminated in the interest of unifying opposites, consonants and dissonance, finding one interval which represents both. So in that sense, you could also say that it was a sonic, you could say it's the yin and yang symbol in a sonic form.
I wanted to ask you about the dates that you provided, because that seemed quite odd to me, because you said that you mentioned 2033 as if it was in the past, saying that we are in 2083, if I'm not mistaken. Could you expand on that? What did you mean? What was the premise of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this whole performance lecture is a sort of speculative storytelling, and I'm taking the role of a musicologist who in 2083 presents his research. And the result of this research is that Sieglinde Stern was the inventor of the pickup. So to put this into the future was for me a way to make obvious that this is fiction. And it also made it easier to build the historic references, because if I would say in 2003, the last concert with an electric guitar that took place, then everybody would say, this is not true, we just heard one last night. But if I say in 2033, the last concert took place, then, well, maybe I'm going to be right, nobody can tell. So this is
Yes, I understand.
basically just the kind of dramaturgy of the storytelling.
That's an interesting device, to be honest. I would not have thought of that. I didn't understand it at first, but yes, it makes sense now that you explained it. But you also included a theoretical work in placing it in 2090 something.
Yes.
And that is the only thing that would confuse me. If we were to be in 2083, according to your presentation, how could we look into the future from the 80s into the 90s? That's what confuses me.
No, we're looking back. I'm looking from 2083. I'm referring to a theory which was already invented in 1996, I think. So, I mean, we're constantly talking about philosophers like Hegel and so on. They're also 150 years.
But you place it in 2090, I think, 90 something.
No. There is one theory which is in 1996, and the other one is in 2059. And so
59. Okay,
yeah.
Maybe I got mistaken there. Okay, yes, makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Marko. Thank you so much for this lecture. I learned a lot. I was wondering, I wanted to hear more about other projects where you integrate layers of reality, layers of now, using media. Of course, I referenced the work in Zagreb, the Skylar project, but it seems to crop up again and again. I just wanted to hear how you think through this weaving layers of reality in general.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think that's something that that fascinates me a lot in my more recent works. And it's basically what I said earlier. I like I mean, it's not so uncommon. It's this idea of rewriting the past as a thought experiment is relatively popular nowadays, and I find it very interesting to explore this in musical contexts. And what I like about it is, first of all, to study the past, to understand things better, and then to start to twist things around, and then to see, okay, but what if we change this? How does the past look like to us? And I mean, history is, I'm not a historian, and I'm not familiar with the methodologies with the proper methodologies of historians, but it's a very sort of a slippery territory, because of course, when we look into the past, there are true facts and things that simply did not happen. But nevertheless, every history that is told is also an interpretation. And so it's always a sort of selection process that historians inevitably have to make. And it's always a sort of speculation also how things are really connected. And so I think it's also, we very often take history for granted. And I think it's interesting just to remind ourselves that history can also be read in many different ways, true history, I mean. And then now from an artistic point of view, as I said, I find it exciting to use this basically as a creative field where I can shape stories and thereby create particular meanings that I want to explore in a particular work. And the first work where I've done that is, in an explicit way, is Anna and Marie. That's a project I did in Donaueschingen 5 years ago or 4 years ago. And there I was studying the lives and artistic activities of two female anatomists who lived in the 18th century. And one of them lived in Bologna, the other one in Paris. And what I found very fascinating is that they were contemporaries. And even if in the 18th century, Paris and Bologna, that was not really that far away. But yeah, they never met. And partly they had the same commissioners. And so I found that really interesting. And therefore, I created this piece where I basically staged an encounter between Marie Bicharon and Anna Morandi, that were their names. And it was a kind of interactive game design performed by two violinists, one playing electric violin, the other Baroque violin. And through their playing, they could decide how the conversation between the two would go on. So it was a so-called ergodic storytelling. So it was not just one story, but you could create around 40 or 50 different varieties of stories. And of course, musically, this was all connected to then musical generative synthesis, playing instructions for the musicians, light design, video was involved. So basically, there were many, many different versions how you could perform this piece. And yeah, so this is just another example where I've done something slightly related. Does this answer your question? Okay.
Could you tell us some more about the Black Horizon? Do you think that we are moving towards this mysterious frontier, or is it possible somehow to avoid it?
This is interesting the way you read the title, because for me 14 years ago the title was I think much more personal situation I found myself in, that it was a time of change and I didn't know what was coming. And so basically the title just described my personal state of being at that time, and it was not really an observation on a global scale of the situation we are in. Yes, let's better leave it at that, otherwise this becomes a complicated discussion.
So I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned the piece for two violins when you used one electric violin. Here we have an example of your pieces and installations with electric guitar. And my question was, how did your work look like before choosing to use electric instruments, and maybe not electronics in general, because that's more broad, but electric instruments per se? How did your work look like? What did you focus on, and what made you want to try electric instruments?
I'm not only using electric instruments. In the case of the electric guitar, it's just that I like the electric guitar much better than the acoustic guitar. No offense, but I find it much more versatile as an instrument, and I'm also not a guitarist myself, so I guess it's also easier for me to fool around with an electric guitar than with an acoustic guitar. I mean, in the context of technology, I do have to say that, for example, when you want to create interactivities, things very often get very messy when you work with acoustic signals, because then you have many different interferences, the signal is not as clean and so on. So it just makes life easier in certain situations. But this is not the main reason. Like in Anna and Marie, I mean, I've written a couple of pieces for electric violins, but I wouldn't say necessarily that I like the electric violin better than the acoustic violin. In that case, it's the other way around. I would say that the acoustic violin is more versatile than the electric one. But in the case of Anna and Marie, I was also interested to create this historical contrast, to use Baroque violin on one hand, not only acoustic, but really Baroque violin, and also worked with an early music performer who performed that part. And then I just wanted to have a contrast, and just having Baroque violin and normal violin, I don't think would have made the point really clear. So I thought as a contrast, it was more interesting to have electric and Baroque. Yes, but generally speaking, I wouldn't say that I necessarily prefer electric instruments. But I do often also use only electronics as an instrument. So I often perform myself also with an electronic setup, and then the electronics are definitely purely synthetic.
And do you prefer, when it comes to maybe classical instruments, or in general, do you prefer smaller ensembles or working with like orchestras and bigger ensembles?
Definitely small ensembles. Yeah, one of the more recent commissions for an ensemble was for a saxophone quartet and a multimedia performer, and I found it really hard. I mean, I'm happy with how the piece turned out, but for me, this felt like way too many musicians, and it was only 4 of them or 5. Yeah, I'm very interested in the relationship that you can establish between a technological setup that the performer can interact with. And I think this is something that can be explored in much more transparent and, for me, more interesting ways if you have a very small number of performers. So very often I have 2 performers and a kind of audiovisual setup. But I would say, yeah, my favorite settings are solo and duo. Any other questions?
Okay, if there are no questions, I would like to say many thanks for your lecture and for the pieces. Certainly, I'll be trying to learn more about your music after this experience, and I hope we'll meet you here in Warsaw with another project.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.